interest in believing the pivot, because otherwise they're kind of left at sea, and many countries are left with hard choices about whether they develop their nuclear capacity to deal with various threats, North Korea and so on, and that the U.S. would ultimately, in the long run, be unable to sustain essentially a sucker's bet. That is, of countries hedging on the security issue by relying on U.S. financial and military guarantees, financial and military, while bandwagoning economically with China. So China gets the economic deal, we get stuck with the security bill, and that's not a very saleable or durable situation for the U.S. Is that critique fair?
I would disagree, but I think June wants to answer that.
All right. You'll both get a shot at it.
It's the idea that the U.S. is declining has been in and out of vogue since the 70s. And I guess the question is, in what context is the U.S. declining? Economically, the U.S. is not facing. Let's look financially first. Economically, the U.S. is not facing a depression. Europe, on the other hand, is in a depression, although they don't realize it because it's sector by sector. And Japan is about to enter a depression with a 3-to-1 debt to GDP ratio. All the just-in-time infrastructure for production has left since Fukushima incident and has not come back. And the demographics are working against Japan. So those are the two negatives. China's economic downturn, I think, was due to inflated food prices, which are coming back down, and the U.S. is in an economic recovery. So I don't think that on a financial front that the U.S. is declining. On the security front, I think the reality of the issue of arms sales to Taiwan, of PLA's military modernization, is you have to look at the global perspective and ask yourself, what has to happen in the world for war to break out? How bad does it have to be? And how much should we prepare for that? Versus how much should we appear to be preparing for that? So do we really want to, does China really want the ability to manage the sea lanes of communication? Because right now they simply can't. Does Taiwan really want to be able to defend itself against a full-scale attack by the PRC? Hypothetically, the PRC wants to launch it, and how much are we going to divert financially to that and diplomatically to that, versus we divert enough to that to appear that we are concerned about that and we can act on it if need be, versus we're really focusing on the global economy and trade. And I guess it depends on which worst case, best case, status quo scenario we're discussing. But I would disagree with the idea that the U.S. is declining. And you can look at the playbook that North Korea is using right now. Non-Q, PRC, like an actor in the third act is coming into play, and it's almost following a script. And the fact that they're doing that, I think, still recognizes the U.S. as the predominant power.
I'd like to add another dimension to this security consideration. In the geo-economic age that is upon us, I think nations have to worry not only about their traditional defense security, but also economic security. And this pivot policy of the United States, or trying to rebound, has produced a phenomenon whereby Southeast Asian nations can rely on the United States for their military security, while they also have to depend on China for their economic security. So let's keep that in mind. This is split personality almost for all these countries.
That's the sucker's bet risk. I know June wants to weigh in on this, so let her do that, then I want to get back to you on some of the economic issues.
Okay, I absolutely agree with Professor Wolf that it is amiss to just assume the United States is declining. And a former Prime Minister of Singapore, apparently one of the criteria to be Prime Minister of Singapore is that you get to be very, very blunt sometimes. And
The thing about getting to be about 90 is
Anyway, he said very explicitly to the Chinese that it is a mistake to assume that the United States is declining, because we've seen temporary dips before, and the United States always manages to come back. So he said, please do not predicate your policy on the United States declining. But as I look at various trends around the world, some of which Professor Wolf mentioned, I think what I'm seeing is the decline and fall of practically everybody. And it is absolutely true that Japan has some real problems. But on the other hand, let's look at that population decline that they're wringing their hands about. That they managed to practically win World War II with a much smaller population. And in some ways, having too many people is not a great idea, as most Chinese will be happy to tell you. And the other thing is that China's economy is not growing that fast anymore. And a large part of it is specious growth anyway, because it's money injected, stimulus money injected. Local governments have enormous debts. Those cannot be forgotten, and so on and so forth. And Europe, of course, is a real mess. So that's what I meant. Now, on to the pivot. I personally tend to be one of these people who's on the skeptical side. Obama is saying we're going to draw down our presence in the Middle East. I'm not sure how we do that, because every time we announce we're going to, we've got some problem in the Middle East under control, some other problem breaks out in several other Middle Eastern countries. So I don't see us withdrawing. I teach a course on U.S. defense policy, and so I've been following the belated release of the hypothetical U.S. defense budget for fiscal year 14. Yeah, and it requires enormous cuts, which are still nowhere near what the sequestration demands. I have seen what we're cutting back on. I have talked to people in the Defense Department who are anticipating furloughs, and I frankly don't see how we can cover the latest annual mess, the mess of the month in the Middle East, while making a meaningful pivot. And so, unless something untoward and good happens between now and then, I don't see us having the money to spend on implementing a pivot.
So this, of course, is the question of absolute versus relative decline. I think few would dispute that the U.S. gap is clearly coming down, even though it's remained a dominant power. That is the other part of the relevant quotation from, what is he now, Minister Immortal? Big money got from Prime Minister to Senior to Mentor. But and I think this captures some of what makes Taiwan's neighborhood so dangerous and volatile, is that yes, there is a risk that China will overestimate the decline in U.S. capacity and will. But what Lee also told his interlocutors is that, of course, China wants to dominate its region. That's what great powers do. That's a tradition. And the risk of the collision of those two things is problematic and a concern for everyone, including Taiwan. And Taiwan may be in an interesting position of having relatively good relations with both China and the U.S. And may have special insight, and of course, unfortunately, sometimes special focus on that. I want to turn to some of the economic issues. In terms of Taiwan-U.S. relations, of course, we've seen some progress there. The TECO talks are back on. We still continue to stumble over beef and pork and other such issues.
Didn't President Ross say beef is set?
It has been, but it has been a troublesome issue, and pork still is. And there are questions of liberalization to get forward with TECO. I mean, I would suggest that getting any free trade agreement, right? It looks like a free trade agreement through Congress right now is going to be devilishly difficult. But what's your sense, James, of both the possibility and the significance of Taiwan pursuing closer economic ties with the U.S. and with countries in its own region other than the mainland?
Well, we have to think geoeconomically, because Taiwan is a place without natural resources. It's 80% dependent on imported natural resources. And therefore, there is a tendency, once the threat from TIFA and the Free Trade Association with Taiwan would keep Taiwan from going that way and keep Taiwan where it should be.
And the RCEP too, with the ASEAN.
Yeah. And so I think we should, if we think geo-economically, then we should understand how, where TIFA and FTA come into the picture.
All right, and of course, one of the promises of ECFA was that it would open the door to Taiwan pursuing closer economic ties with other countries in the Asian region and allow some of that balancing. We're seeing two things play out. One is deepening integration with the mainland continuing, plus the opening of these other doors. All right, I do want to leave some time for our audience to raise questions as well, so I want to shift gears yet again back to something we touched upon a bit, but I don't think probed as far as we probably should under current circumstances, and that's the maritime territorial issues of the East China Sea and the South China Sea, was a significant part of President Ma's address, of course, and he offered the East China Sea Peace Initiative last August and suggested that the principles could extend to the South China Sea as well a couple of months later. At some level, it's a fairly familiar list, one that one could find elements of in U.S. policy for the regions and mainland policy for the region. Ma's specific list, which includes refraining from hostile or antagonistic activities, putting aside differences and keeping dialogue going, of following international law and pursuing peaceful means, seeking a code of conduct for operations and development in the area, and pursuing cooperative approaches to development. That said, though, it's in some ways been a controversial undertaking because it has, of course, been entangled with the Japanese nationalization of the Senkaku, Diaoyudao, Diaoyutai, I don't know what to call it, those landforms in East China Sea. You can't even speak without appearing to take a side. So I think we've had a very complex alignment of partial parallels and partial contradictions, as it were, among all concerned parties, Taiwan, China, and the U.S., as well as Japan, of course. So, June, I know you've worked a lot on the East China Sea issues. What's your sense of how this all plays out? Does the East China Sea Peace Initiative look like a promising approach to this? What are the consequences of President Ma pursuing that in terms of relations with the other principal players?
Well, I think, first of all, that this is a real coup on his part to have achieved this agreement. And
The
fisheries agreement with Japan. And this by Ma, for, I guess most of you know this, that Ma had a reputation for being anti-Japanese. And
never let anyone read your doctoral dissertation.
So the fact that he perhaps of all people was able to achieve this is a real, I don't know, feather in his cap is such an antiquated expression, but who has feathers in their cap and when did that start kind of thing. But anyhow, that was no doubt that was an achievement. And I know that this speech with Stanford was planned a long time ago, but how nice for him that it came along just 6 days before he was to make this speech. So now he is holding this forth as a beacon, if you will, for other countries to negotiate the same way. But I don't think it has too much hope of working with Japan and China, the other major claimant to those islands, because I have actually watched these negotiations going on between China and Japan for years and years and years. And I believe it was 2007 that they finally reached an agreement. The media just went wild. It's a solution, blah, blah, blah. This is wonderful. And then what the agreement very carefully said is, we will leave the details to be worked out later. And what happened is they couldn't work out the details, and they've been at each other's throats ever since. And that's only the latest of these efforts. So I would say there's probably many pitfalls ahead. And there's a lot of history here between, for example, the Vietnamese and the Chinese. The seizure of the Paracels in 74, 75 by the Chinese, just as the North Vietnamese were about to take over from South Vietnam and get those islands themselves. Years and years of history, streets that, you know, when Ho Chi Minh took over North Vietnam, they renamed all of the streets proper things like Liberation Street and that sort of thing. The only street they didn't rename was a street named after the two sisters who led the effort to kick the Chinese out hundreds of years before. That means something. The changing of the Saigon's name to Ho Chi Minh City, nobody got that who doesn't know Chinese. What Saigon meant, it's Qigong, Western tribute. Yeah, I mean, they weren't going to have that anymore. Saigon was a tributary of China. And so this goes way back with both the Philippines and the Japanese. The Philippines, I think, are just going to give in because they always do.
The Navy's down to 2 leaky rowboats and a raft. So.
Yeah.
Sorry, Philippines.
Yeah. I think the other agreements are going to be much harder to get. I can only praise Ma for the agreement he did get, and very carefully saying that this does not affect either side's claims to sovereignty, although it might be added that the Taiwan boats will respect Taiwan's 12-mile limit there. So in a way, you know, that might impinge, but still, I mean, coup for him, but not probably going to work very well for others.
May I add something?
Sure, go ahead.
I think the East China Peace initiative mentioned by President Ma should be extended to South China Sea too.
He's proposed that idea.
Yes, because South China Sea is more complicated. Over parasols, Vietnam and China fought 2 wars, and there are 7 parties, including China and Taiwan and so on, claiming strategies. So now the
But not all of these countries.
well,
That
yes,
different countries claim
different
different
parts.
pieces.
China claimed, the
Yeah.
Chinese claim was everything.
Only
The
China
entire-
claims
all
all
of
the
it.
Spratlys, but there are other
the
claims.
entire South China Sea. Now, the fishery agreement reached by President Ma with the Japanese, I think that can set as an example. So that means we dispense with the sovereignty issue, and let's talk about business. And that, I think, can be used in settling disputes in South China Sea too. And in fact, after fighting 2 wars on the parasols, 1975 and 88, China and Vietnam did reach an agreement, and this is not known outside. And I know it because I heard it from someone in the Chinese Foreign Ministry. They did sign an agreement in 1993, dispensing their sovereignty claims and agreeing to collaboratively exploit resources in parasols, whatever they are. And so I think that formula can be used in settling other disputes too, including the East China dispute.
Yeah, on this issue, I'd just say a couple of things. So one is, much as I like to defend the tribe of which both President Ma and I are members, that is international lawyers, this strikes me as an area where international law is singularly unhelpful. Where you've got these uninhabitable rocks and islands, effectively, at all sides, the ROC, the PRC, the other 4 or 5 claimants in the South China Sea and Japan, where you've got into this situation where no one can effectively control those in the ordinary way. You can't really govern them, you can't really put people on them. What you've got as a game is where everyone needs to assert control or push back against others, asserting the minimal control you have in these islands. So you have this invitation, almost, or this pressure to send some hapless guy with wet boots and a flag out there, or to send out the fishing trawlers, and behind them the white hull Coast Guard ships, and behind them the gray hull Navy ships, because if you don't, the other guy's going to claim it. And so there is this risk of escalation, this tendency to do tit for tat, to protect the sovereignty claim, even as you negotiate about other undertakings. So I think we're in for long-term, low-grade friction some accident will occur that will escalate that. And it's just built into the way these things work, because all the really valuable stuff, the sea lanes around the rocks, the hydrocarbons that may be under the waters off of them, those all hang off the question of who owns the landform and how much the landform is account for. So we're going to see a lot of
But the PRC is in a much better position than any of the other claimants to actually
right, it's got the biggest
occupy and enforce. And the founding of Samsha
right.
in June is an important
You
step.
do what you can, and the most significant worrisome signs in terms of maintaining stability on these issues, it seems to me, and one of the things that makes something like the peace initiative